There's a handful of us that have this belief that, innovation has stopped even many years before Facebook, Google, and Amazon. It's just that they make it easier to see in broad daylight. We've gone from a world where we used to have incredibly ambitious objectives that both reasonable and unreasonable people would consider valuable and then would support. The Apollo project is a good example. Manhattan Project is another example. And since then, we've been in actually like a 50-year sort of cycle of secular decay in terms of the technological vibrancy we've seen. They just allow us to see it more manifestly in front of our eyes. So we live in a world right now where, in the absence of something exogenous that stops those companies from essentially continuing their dominance, then the amount of innovation we see will continue to monotonically decay until people are even more frustrated and feel even more sort of left out than they are.
Is that because they don't, but you've talked about Bezos being an incredible allocator of capital. Don't some of these problems, associated with machine learning, AI, require this scale? And yet you seem to be making the argument that they don't innovate at scale.
Well, they don't. Look, again, just macro speaking, how many of you in the audience have built a house in the last 10 years? Built a house. And if I asked you on average, I would say the average amount of time it took you to build a house was probably 2 to 3 years. And if it was more grandiose, it would be even more. It took us 18 months to build the Empire State Building. And now you can't build a single-family home in less than 2 or 3 years. It took us 3 or 4 years to build the Golden Gate Bridge. Now you try to put a throughway in between, 2 neighborhoods, it takes 5 years. So we, as a whole societal species, have had this tendency to introduce inefficiency as technical innovation has gone down. So what big companies do is they absorb that inefficiency and promulgate it into the world. Why is it that in the last 30 or 40 years, the biggest advent in semiconductors and chips really has been Intel? Why is it that we still run on general purpose compute? All the great fangled ideas that we may have about AI and this and that, and yet we still haven't invented a compute fabric that can compete with Intel or NVIDIA. And these are all poor men's solutions that are a byproduct of just corporate bureaucracy and excess cash. So,
I'm going to interrupt. Keep going.
No, so my point is, it's not that we're past some point of salvation.
Right.
It's not that. I'm actually deeply optimistic about what can happen in the future. But in order to do it, the pendulum, which has swung, in my opinion, far too far to the extreme of this unproductive form of hypercapitalism, now needs to swing in the other direction. Hypercapitalism is embodied when there's a complete divorcing between the company's shareholders and the company's stakeholders. The shareholders are a bunch of nameless, faceless hedge funds who basically demand that you take as much money as possible, you buy back stock, or you do nothing with it. Stakeholders would say, invest it, put it into your people. Every time, you and I had this conversation flying out here, it confounds me whenever I see great companies say, you know what, we are fabulous, we love our people, and then they pay at the 50th percent of a salary band. First of all, why do these salary surveys exist? And second of all, why would any great company not just say, I'm great, I pay at the 100% of the band. I pay at the 100% of the band, and then I expect 100% of the performance. So we go through all of these machinations that instead just allow us to bloat and bloat and bloat and bloat. Yet, when the things that are required to be done, the capital doesn't exist because it's already been misallocated. So if you create a mechanism where capitalism can come back, where you can merge the shareholder and the stakeholder, where employees and individuals are more incentivized to be actually truly innovative and create, you start to right the ship. And what's going to happen is a bunch of turbulent manifestations of frustration, aka populism, that then eventually calm itself down and it'll factor itself into policy. This is why these big companies will get regulated. They will absolutely get broken up. This is not 1999 Microsoft DOJ. This is basically the turn of the century Gilded Age, or this is, it's that kind of schism that we are probably embarking on. I don't really have a personal view of what's better or worse, except I think change is generally good. And if you look at the last 40 to 50 years, anything that starts to reverse this trend is really productive for the world.